Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me and see me? I hope that's not a problem.
Yes, you're audible.
Great. Hi, so welcome to today's video. Today we will discuss certain important things that happened in the month of December. So luckily for you, luckily for us, December wasn't a very important month as far as your current affairs for economics and international relations, etc. are concerned. So therefore, we'd probably be able to finish whatever important happened in the month of December in this single lecture today. Okay. So the first thing that I want to talk to you about is the Brexit trade deal. So if you've been following the news, maybe since the last 3 4 years, this term Brexit has been on the news, and there has been a lot of commentary about Brexit. There has been a lot of discussions about Brexit. There have been multiple articles about Brexit, right? So it's very likely that there'll be a question on Brexit, especially now since the final agreement, which as in gives out the terms and conditions of the breakout between the European Union and the United Kingdom, is going to be finalized. Okay, so let's just look at what's the history of the European Union and what is the context in which we are discussing this by in 2020, right? Because the decision to leave Britain was basically taken in 2016 in a referendum, and then the timeline, or the 11-month timeline that was supposed to kick in, also happened in January 2020. So let's look at why we are studying this in December 2020. Okay, so before that, let's understand what the EU is. So EU is effectively, one second. Okay. Yeah, so EU is effectively an economic as well as a political union. And if you look at the total number of the countries in the EU, there are 27 countries. Now, the primary idea between EU is that it would be a free trade. There would be free trade between the countries. There wouldn't be tariffs, right? So effectively, it will be one nation, one market, which is something that the government of India has also borrowed from the European Union. So when you talk about things like GST, or when you talk about things like having or abolishing mandis, etc., and having file and allowing farmers to trade throughout the country, the idea that you try to talk about is this particular idea of one nation, one market, right? And so the European Union has basically expanded this idea, and they've said one continent, one market effectively. Okay, so the EU treaty, so the European Union basically allows people to move freely across each other, across the countries, and you can live there, you can trade there, and you can choose to work in whichever country you wish to. You don't have visa requirements, etc. Right? So it's effectively being treated as a single country. So EU was born in 1993. It was created under this treaty known as the Maastricht Treaty. Okay. Now, this Maastricht Treaty was then upgraded and amended by December 2009. So, in the 2009 amendment, there was an Article 50 to the Lisbon Treaty, and this article envisaged that okay, there might be a time in the future that some of the countries might want to leave the European Union for reasons best known to themselves, right? So they incorporated an Article 50, and this article and the other articles that follow this Article 50 gave out detailed procedures about how to exit the European Union. Okay. Now, one of the provisions of the Lisbon Treaty under Article 50 and the following article and the articles following it is that if you have to leave the European Union, you have to negotiate a settlement deal with the European Union. There cannot be a no deal exit, right? Because for a long time, these countries, and I mean European Union and the country that is deciding to leave, have basically developed a lot of linkages and networks, and a lot of systems themselves have been integrated. So it's going to be very hard for countries to leave the European Union without a deal, and it will be a thorny issue for both the parties involved. So in the Lisbon Treaty itself, it captures that you have to have a settlement deal with the EU. Okay. Now, the process. So finally, what has now happened is that now EU and UK, under this provision of the Lisbon Treaty, have decided that okay, now we will have a treaty or an agreement that will define the future relationship between United Kingdom and European Union. So the interesting thing to note here is that if there is a question on European Union, they would probably try to confuse you by saying that the EU was created by, and one of the options would be Lisbon Treaty and Maastricht Treaty. Now, because you would be reading a lot about Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty in the news, please do not mark Lisbon Treaty. Lisbon Treaty is an amendment to the Maastricht Treaty. Okay, so EU wasn't formed by the Lisbon Treaty. Please keep this in mind. Anyways, so this process of United Kingdom leaving European Union and another body called the Euratom or the European Atomic Energy Community. This entire idea of the UK leaving both of them is known as the process is known as Brexit. Okay. Now again, Euratom was established by Euratom Treaty on in 1957. So another trick question could be that the Euratom was also founded under the Maastricht Treaty. That would be wrong. Euratom, or the European and Atomic Energy Community, which basically deals with storage of nuclear material, transportation, generation of new nuclear energy, and exporting surplus energy to non-member countries. All of that is dealt by the European Atomic Energy Community. Okay. Now, this precedes the European Union. So please keep this in mind. The Atomic Energy Community came before the European Union, and the European Union came much later in 1993. So in 2016, there was a referendum in England, and by a very narrow margin, Britain chose to leave the European Union, and the timeline, and so that, and it was finalized that Britain will formally leave the European Union in January 2020, after which they had an 11-month transition period in accordance with the agreement. And one of the provisions of the agreement is that you have to have an agreement, and you have to finalize an agreement within this transition period. And this is the agreement that has now been finalized. So let's look at the major provisions of this agreement or the deal between the UK and the EU. The first thing is vis-a-vis goods trade. Now both the parties have decided that there would be no extra quotas or tariffs for trade between the EU and UK. So trade as far as goods trade is concerned, there would be no change between as in there would be no change in the way trade was conducted between these two countries in terms of tariffs and excise duties and quotas, etc. Obviously, there would be proper borders now, and you would have new regulatory hurdles which are generally there if you're transitioning from one country to another. It's just that there won't be any tariffs or quotas, but everything else would be a little new. Okay. Then this talks about a level playing field, which basically says that both under the European Union had made certain environmental, social, labor, and tax transparency commitments throughout the world, and they had developed a common standard which was being followed in all of the European Union. So now it has been decided that even though the UK is going to leave the European Union, it will uphold the environmental, social, labor, and all tax transparency standards, and there won't be any changes to that. Now, one very interesting thing is about professional services. Now, earlier, professional qualification in, let's say, Britain was recognized in Belgium, or professional qualification in France was recognized in England. Now, because both the parties have decided to split, professional services and professional qualifications will no longer be automatically mutually recognized. Like universities, organizations, etc., will have to tie up with each other. There won't be an automatic recognition of professional qualification. Now, vis-a-vis agriculture as well. So basically for agriculture and goods trade, there would be no tariffs or quotas. Now, with regards to law, both the parties have decided that it is in their common mutual interest to continue cooperation between the EU and the UK, especially in sensitive cases like international terrorism and other serious crime. Now, another interesting thing is about mobility and freedom of movement. As I told you, by being a part of the European Union, you didn't need visa, etc., to move within the European Union. But now, since since the United Kingdom has decided to come out of the European Union, now if let's say a British citizen or a citizen of the United Kingdom wishes to start a business or live in the EU, he can only do that for 90 days. Now, if you want to, as a British citizen, if you want to extend your stay in the European Union beyond this timeline of 90 days, you will have to now formally apply for a visa to the European Union. Okay, so this is pretty much it that happened vis-a-vis Brexit. So you should be aware of what Brexit is, what the European Union is, what is the foundational treaty for the European Union, what is the treaty under which, and Article 50, if you can, you should remember, not if you can, but you should remember that Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty basically gives out the process for disintegration of a country or removal of a country from the European Union. So these are things you should absolutely remember, and you should try to remember the major provisions of the deal vis-a-vis what are going to be the actual changes with regards to the relationship between Britain and European Union. Okay. Now, the second thing that happened in international relations is a very exciting thing. This is that the United States Senate, or basically their parliament, their upper house, their Rajya Sabha, they passed the Tibetan Policy and Support Act of 2020, which basically outlines and formalizes the policy that United States has vis-a-vis Tibet. Now, these are very interesting times that we are living in terms of the relationship between US and China. So if you've not been living under the rock, you know the relationship between US and China has been deteriorating. So this is another step. This is a sort of a pressure tactic that the United States has now adopted. United States suddenly has this great love for Tibet and Tibetan people and Dalai Lama, and they've suddenly recognized the environmental importance of Tibet, primarily because they want to create another pressure point for China. Okay. Now let's look at the important provisions of this Tibetan of the new Tibetan Policy and Support Act, or the TPSA. Okay. Now, the TPSA of 2020 is not the first time that US has a policy on Tibet. They had a landmark Tibetan Policy Act of 2002. Okay. Now, this is basically built around whatever was mentioned in the Tibetan Policy Act, and it adds a little more to the Tibetan Policy Act. So this new act looks at three things. First is that it addresses and looks to talks about the issues of human right violation in Tibet. Then it talks about the environmental implications of the Chinese activities, etc., in Tibet, and general importance of Tibet to the global environment. And it also talks about the religious freedom and the Tibetan government in exile. Okay. Now, under this treaty, it formally recognizes the Central Tibetan Administration as the legitimate representative of the Tibetan people. Now, obviously, the Tibetan government does not sit in Tibet. The Tibetan government is in exile. So basically, citizens of Tibet or people of Tibetan lineage across the world, they get together and then they vote and they choose a government. Now, this government obviously doesn't reside within Tibet. Can anyone tell me where the Central Tibetan Administration is located? I mean, this is something that you should know. Anybody wants to take a guess? It's not a very hard answer. No one? Cool. So the Central Tibetan Administration is located in Dharamshala in India, and the current president of the Central Tibetan Administration is Mr. Lobsang Sangye. Now, these are two names that you should remember, two things that you should remember, that the Central Tibetan Administration is in Dharamshala and the president is Lobsang Sangye. Now, apart from formally recognizing the Central Tibetan Administration, this act now also talks about the religious freedom of people of Tibet, and it also addresses a very important thing, very important issue that will be a thorn in the US China and and in fact India China relationship also in the future, which is the succession of Dalai Lama. So now the United States government says that if China or any of Chinese officials interferes with the selection or succession of the Dalai Lama, then it has the right to impose economic and visa sanctions on such officials. Now, the Dalai Lama is not a person per se. The Dalai Lama is a post. Okay, so the Dalai Lama is the spiritual head of the Tibetan people. Okay, so the current Dalai Lama that we see, that we are very familiar with, is not the first Dalai Lama. He's the 14th Dalai Lama, and his name is Mr. Tenzin Gyatso. Now, in Tibetan culture, there are two lamas. One is Dalai Lama and one is Panchen Lama. So the Dalai Lama is basically the spiritual head of the Tibetan people, and he has multiple roles and responsibilities. The other Lama that we have is the Panchen Lama. So the sole role of the Panchen Lama is to pick the successor of the Dalai Lama, right? So whenever Dalai Lama dies, it is Panchen Lama's duty to pick the next Dalai Lama. So, and Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama is also obviously chosen by the Dalai Lama. So they have a cyclical relationship. Now, Dalai Lama, the current Dalai Lama, had chosen a Panchen Lama, and that Panchen Lama has basically disappeared, and it is widely believed that that Panchen Lama has probably been kidnapped or killed or maybe brainwashed by China, and China is now claiming that there is a new Panchen Lama. Okay, so when the 14th Dalai Lama, which is Mr. Tenzin Gyatso, dies, which probably will happen within the next decade, now China would say that the next or the 15th Dalai Lama would then be propped up by China, right? So it'll be a very pro-China Dalai Lama because China effectively controls who the Panchen Lama is, right? So there is a big hodgepodge here, and the United States has now said that we do not want China to interfere at all in the process of succession of Dalai Lama, because the entire point of Dalai Lama is that the Tibetan people think of Dalai Lama as their spiritual head. Tibetan people do not believe that they are Chinese. Tibetan people say that we are different from China, and China is basically colonizing us, and China has taken over Tibet by force. Now, if obviously the Dalai Lama is also chosen by the Chinese, and if the Panchen Lama is also chosen by the Chinese, then the idea would be that over a few years or few generations, China would effectively incorporate Tibet, and it would eliminate all sorts of oppositions to its legitimate claim over Tibet. Okay. So this is another provision of the TPSA. Now, the third provision of the TPSA is that the TPSA suddenly now says that there should be a global consensus vis-a-vis environment and water resources on the Tibetan plateau. Now, obviously, the Tibetan plateau is very important because outside of the North Pole and the South Pole, the Tibetan plateau has the highest number of glaciers anywhere on the earth. And for that reason, it is also referred to as the third pole. Okay. Now, Tibet plays a major role in your Asian this thing monsoons, right? Tibet, the Tibetan plateau, along with the Himalayas. So if we didn't have the Himalayas and the Tibetan plateau, probably we wouldn't have such a fertile Ganga river belt, and we would probably not, and India could probably be a much larger desert, just like Tibet is. Okay. Now, moving forward to the relationship between India and Tibet. Right? So as I've said, that a lot of countries in the world believe that Tibet is not a part of China and that China does not have a legitimate claim over Tibet. However, when we come to India, let's look at what is the official position of India on China and of India on Tibet. Now, officially, India has a one China policy. That it means that it does not recognize the fact that Taiwan or the Republic of China is a separate entity. It says that People's Republic of China, which is the mainland Chinese state, is the original and the true representative of the people of China. Okay. And India has generally not played the Tibet card. The reason probably is that because under a treaty which was signed in 1954 on trade and transportation on the border between India and China pertaining to Tibet, India formally recognized that Tibet is a part of China. Now, once you give it in writing in a treaty, that Tibet is a part of China, you really don't have any locus standi or a moral standing to then oppose and say that no, Tibet is not a part of China, right? So India has officially, under this 1954 treaty, has recognized Tibet to be a part of China. Okay. Now, India does not have a law on Tibet, like the US has a law, right? TPSA, which is precisely what we're discussing right now. India doesn't have a law or a formal law on Tibet. It just has an executive policy on Tibet, which is known as the Tibet Rehabilitation Policy of 2014. Now, this policy is basically lip service. It does not talk about any substantive issues of relevance to the core idea of Tibet, as in what Chinese are doing in Tibet, etc., demands of freedom of Tibet, etc. They are not covered in the Tibet rehabilitation policy. So it's basically a lip service policy. There's nothing of substance for us to even study in that policy. Okay. One second. Good. So the next thing that I want to talk to you about is the Chabar Port. Okay. Now, Chabar Port is a port located in Iran. This is the first port outside of India that India is investing in. Okay. So recently in December, there was the meeting of the first trilateral working group between India, Iran, and Uzbekistan on how they will use the Chabar port once the Chabar port is formally constructed. Now, obviously, owing to the pandemic, this meeting was conducted virtually. Now, guys, this topic that I'm going to discuss with you is not just important vis-a-vis Chabar port. Now, in our previous videos, we've discussed a lot of relationships, right? We've discussed relationship of India with other countries. So this part of the video is going to cover the Chabar port. Obviously, it will also substantially cover India and Iran relationships. Okay, so this is basically where the Chabar port is going to be constructed. It's in the Gulf of Oman, and this coast of Iran on which you have the Chabar coast is called the Makran coast. Okay, so let's look at some details about the Chabar port. Now it is located, as I told you, in the Gulf of Oman on the Makran coast, not Marakan, sorry, Makran coast in Iran. Now it is jointly being developed by India, Iran, and Afghanistan, and for which they have had a agreement in 2016. Now, please keep in mind the entire construction is being done by India, Iran, and Afghanistan. Afghanistan just there for tokenism. So effectively India, but the countries involved are India, Iran, and Afghanistan. Now, if you go back and if you look at the trilateral working group meeting, the countries involved here are Iran, India, and Uzbekistan, and not Afghanistan. Okay, this is not a typo. This is not a mistake. Okay, so the countries involved in construction of the Chabar port and part of the trilateral transit agreement, which was signed way back in 2016, are Iran, India, and Afghanistan. Now, the trilateral working group, which has recently met to decide how the port of Shahabar will be used, does not include Afghanistan. In fact, in place of Afghanistan, you have Uzbekistan. So please remember this distinction. This could very well be a question. Okay. Now, now Chabar Port is very important to us because the distance is not a lot. So it's only 1,000 kilometers from Kandla Port in Gujarat, which is the huge port. And from Mumbai, the distance is about 1,450 kilometers. Now, primarily the benefit of Chabar Port is if you look at the map here, let's say India had to trade with Afghanistan or India had to trade with other Central Asian countries. It had to rely on Pakistan. Now, if you have a port here, now you can effectively bypass Pakistan, and Pakistan is now irrelevant for us if we can trade through the Chahabar port. So this is the relevance of Chahabar port for India. Now you see this dot here, this black dot, this is the Gwadar port. Now, just like we are developing the Chabar port in Iran, China is developing the Gwadar port here in Pakistan. So the China-Pakistan economic corridor passes through China, comes into Pakistani occupied Kashmir, then it comes into Pakistan, and then it basically links to Gwadar port, right? So this is being done by China, and to counter this, we have the Gwadar port. So we want to basically bypass Pakistan. Okay. Now we'll probably in one of the videos we will talk about the CPEC or the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and we will look at the Gwadar port in greater detail. Today's lecture pertains primarily to Chabar port. Okay. Cool. So Chabar port has two terminals. You don't really need to remember the names. They are the Shahid Kalantari and the Shahid Bahishti terminal. Okay. So Shahid Bahishti terminal is a little important because this is the one that is being developed jointly by India, Afghanistan, and Iran. And for developing the Shahid Bahishti terminal, I might be pronouncing it wrong. Forgive me. So the trilateral agreement was signed in 2016, and according to which India will basically have a 10-year lease to develop and operate two terminals. Okay. Now, apart from this terminal, Iran and India would jointly develop a rail network between Chahabar and Zahedan. So Chahabar is basically this port, and Zahedan is right across the border in Afghanistan, right? So we will have a train. So trade. So let's say if India, if at present, one second, if India has to trade with Afghanistan, that trade has to primarily go through Pakistan. Now, if we are able to have this port, now we can ship goods to Shahabar port. From Shahabar port, there will be a rail line or a highway to Zahedan, and from Zahedan to Zaranjan onwards to Kabul and Delaram, there would be another highway. Right. So effectively, we are linking ourselves to Afghanistan and completely bypassing Pakistan. Now, interestingly, Chahabar is India's first overseas port investment. We have a port investment right below Tamil Nadu by China, which is known as the Hambantota port, which is now effectively been taken on a 99-year-old lease by China, right? So this is something that we are also trying to do, except we are not following China and going for predatory loans, etc. We're generally being the nicer guy. Okay. Now let's look at the significance of this port for India. So the primary significance is basically we are going to not boycott, we're going to bypass Pakistan. Now Chahabar also links India to the North-South Transport Corridor. Okay, so North-South Transport Corridor is this corridor which links Bandar Abbas port in Iran to Russia. Okay, so the idea is that let's say some goods have to be sent from, let's say, India or Afghanistan or let's say Iran to Russia. They have to go all the way through the Suez Canal. And recently also we saw that the Suez Canal was blocked, right? So it's the only sort of route of access, right? And that takes a lot of time. Now to shorten that time period, there's a discussion on the north-south transportation corridor, which will be a highway/railway network between Iran and China. So a lot of India-Russia trade, sorry, Iran and Russia. So a lot of trade from India to Central European countries, to Eurasia and to Russia, etc., would now take place through the international north-south transportation corridor. So obviously, if we have Chabar Port, then up till Chabar Port, we can take the naval route, and from there we can take highways or trains, etc. Right. Now, this is also like a rival or an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative China, which is something that we want to do. Now, because of the fact that this is an alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of other smaller Central Asian countries, apart from Uzbekistan, which was now a part of this trilateral working group that we had, they are also emanating and showing some sort of interest in this Chahabar port, because they've also understood that if they become a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, it is very likely that China will capture them in a debt trap, and later China will make them do things that they might not really be comfortable with. Okay. Now obviously there are certain issues with this project, and these issues are basically issues that are let's say hampering India and Iran relationships as well. So the first issue is about international policy on Iran, right? So after the failure of JCPOA, Donald Trump moved into the United States, became the president, and he took a very hardline stance against Iran. So US has unilaterally imposed sanctions on Iran, and because of these sanctions, India-Iran trade relations and India-Iran relationship in general has deteriorated, right? So now India is not importing oil at all from Iran, right? So Iran used to be the third largest supplier of crude oil to India, and right now India is not even importing a liter of crude oil from Iran. So obviously, Iran is not very happy with that decision that has been taken by India, and bilateral trade between India and Iran has completely stopped. Okay. Now it's related to farming as well, because Iran is a huge importer of basmati rice from India, right? And India wants to increase and double farmers' income by 2022. So if let's say India is not exporting basmati rice to Iran, then the price of basmati rice in India is going to fall, and at the end of the day, it's going to be the farmers that are going to lose out. So there are widespread implications on the international sanctions, not international, unilateral United States sanctions on Iran. Now, because of these sanctions, since India is now not buying any crude oil from Iran and bilateral trade has completely stopped, Iran has basically started dropping off India from projects. So initially, as I told you, right, there was a project to build a rail line from Chabar Port to Zahedan. Now, for any project, obviously you need money. The United States said that we will not allow any internationally recognized banking transaction to take place, and if any internationally recognized banking transaction takes place between India and Iran, we will effectively ban those channels and ban those banks. So there has been a delay in a $400 million funding from India to Iran. Now India is not giving this money. India can't give this money because India is fearing sanctions. And suddenly, a country that has stepped in to help Iran is China. So China has basically given Iran huge loans. It is making a lot of investments in Iran, and it is very likely that Iran is now dropping off India as a project partner in a lot of ports and other infrastructure development projects at the behest of China, right? So remember this, Iran wanted a $400 million funding from India. $400 million funding is something which India could not provide. Then China stepped in, and China has given a $400 billion funding, right? So like the scale is just too much. Whatever India does, you cannot match this sort of money. आपसे 400 million नहीं दिया जा रहा, और वहां से चाइना खड़े होके he says, okay, it's okay. I know you are in trouble. Take $400 billion. So this amount of money is just absurd. India obviously cannot match that. So there is obviously a fear that Iran might fall into the debt trap later. But Iran is also facing a lot of internal problems like inflation, unemployment, etc. Now to tackle that, it is now choosing to take this money from China, and it will probably plan later what to do. But in the short term, it is shifting its alliances towards China. Okay. So that's pretty much it that we had to cover vis-a-vis international relations. Now there are, one second. Cool. Now, so there are some other developments that happened in India, these small tidbits of news. So there isn't something major as such. So let's just quickly look at these small little things. So the Cabinet Committee on Security has said that there should be a national security directive on the telecom sector. Now, this is very interesting. Now, before we proceed and talk about what exactly is this directive, okay, so Apurva Singhal has asked this question: how Uzbekistan became a part of this treaty, even though it is not helping in construction? How is Afghanistan okay with it? So Apurva, as I clearly pointed out, the treaty is signed in 2016, and that treaty is for the construction of the Chabar Port, right? So Uzbekistan is not involved in the construction of the Chabar Port. So in that treaty, you have only three parties: India, Iran, and Afghanistan. Okay, and now, okay, cool. Now after that, there is another trilateral working group which talks about the use of the Shahbar airport. So the first treaty is only for construction. उसको बनाया कैसे जाएगा, उसका यूज कैसे किया जाएगा, that would come later. And उसके लिए पहली बार अभी there has been a trilateral working group that has met. Most likely over the next few years other Central Asian countries will also join meetings of that working group. ठीक है, cool. So now let's look at the Indian telecom sector. So before we proceed to what the National Security Directive is, पहचान तो लेते हैं what is the telecom sector. So telecom sector, as you know, India is like huge, right? Population के game में तो हम बहुत आगे हैं हमेशा से. So India is the second largest telecommunications market, and it is also the second largest market in terms of total internet users in India. So India में the subscriber base of people who use phones etc. is 1.16 billion. So effectively 90% of India has phones. But obviously this number is a little skewed. There are people who have 4 or 5 phones also. So अगर आप total number of phones लोगे subscribers, that is 1.16 billion. So effectively also around, if you rationalize this number, around 70 to 75% of India has phones, right? And basically 75% of India is more than 100% of most of the countries in the world. Okay, so therefore India is a huge market. Now if you look at what has been happening globally, is that United States, Canada, UK, they have raised concerns vis-a-vis Chinese equipment maker Huawei. Now Huawei is expanding like very fast into the 5G sector, right? And we all know that as the world progresses, as we need development, we need your Internet of Things, etc. And for all of that to work, we need faster internet and faster networks, right? So for that, the world needs the rollout of 5G networks. Now Huawei is a company, is an equipment making company from China. And recently, globally, there has been a lot of pushback against Huawei. So Canada had also arrested the CEO of Huawei, and there are a lot of diplomatic tussles between Canada and China. So the primary concern here that India has raised and the other countries have been raising is that China is using Huawei to construct as in Huawei will construct and make 5G networks across the world. And the fear is that since China generally has overbearing control over its companies, China will now use Huawei's infrastructure to spy on everyone else. And that is something that the countries are not okay with. Okay. Now, apart from this, recently after Chinese intrusion into India, India had also banned a lot of Chinese mobile apps, etc. So generally, India is not comfortable with intrusion of China, especially in the telecom and tech space in India. Okay. So let's look at what this National Security Directive is. So this is India's first and biggest framework. This means there are three things. First idea is to protect India from cyber attacks. Second is to protect us from data theft and all other vulnerabilities that might arise in the virtual world, right? So this directive effectively tackles that. So if you look at the nitty-gritties of the National Security Directive, the National Security Community, so not community, Committee on Telecom is headed by the Deputy NSA. Please keep in mind, it is not headed by the National Security Advisor, it is headed by the Deputy NSA. Okay, and one of his jobs is to identify trusted sources of telecom equipment. Okay, so it will identify what are the trusted sources, and it will the deputy NSA and the committee will release a negative list. So they will release a list which says that equipment from these companies cannot be used. Okay, now obviously this only applies to new devices. So let's say India was planning to import, or some company in India was planning to import a lot of equipments from Huawei. Now it can't import that, but if let's say the equipment has already been imported and already been installed, and there are service contracts or maintenance and licensing, etc., all of that is still allowed. This directive only applies to, it's a forward looking directive, it only applies to uh, procurement of equipments in the future, right? So now India can't procure equipment from Huawei and other entities as and when, which would, as and when they will be put by the committee in the negative list. But जो अभी तक इंडिया में already आ चुके हैं, if there are maintenance contracts, annual contracts, licenses, etc., that will not be affected. Okay. So this was a very small piece of news. Another small piece of news that I saw in the news was food adulteration, right? So we recently figured out this huge scandal with regards to honey. So honey, which was sold by a lot of major Indian brands, was found to be adulterated with this sugar syrup. Okay. So let's try to understand how something like this can happen. Now, so the Food Standard and Safety Authority of India had basically issued standards, and they had the 2020 standard. Now, there are certain regulations and standards that you have to meet. So all of these adulterants or golden syrup, invert sugar syrup, rice syrup, etc., which was used in adulteration of honey, was primarily being produced from China. And it was designed in a way to defeat the Food Safety Authority standards of India, unke standards, right? So there was this technique that was used to check whether this honey is actually adulterated or not. And this technique was the nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy technique. So this is pretty much it that is important for you, the NMRS technique. And that the standards were the 2020 standards. I doubt that this question can be asked in CLAT because this is very small. इस पे comprehension नहीं आएगा आपको, ठीक है? Anyways, now coming to another larger topic that I want to talk about is what malnutrition amongst children. Cool. So recently what happened was that the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, they released a data fact sheet for 22 states and union territories, which is based on finding of phase 1 of the National Family Health Survey 5. So phase 2, phase 3, etc. data is being accumulated and organized. As of now, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare released data for 22 states and union territories. So before we proceed, I hope I don't have to explain what malnutrition is. Basically, अगर आपको ज़्यादा कम inadequate खाना खा रहे हो या calories ले रहे हो या minerals ले रहे हो, तो that is malnutrition. Malnutrition can broadly be of two types: undernutrition और ओवर न्यूट्रिशन. अंडर न्यूट्रिशन इसको खाना नहीं मिल रहा है, ओवर न्यूट्रिशन जो बहुत ज्यादा एक्सेस में खाना खा रहा है. ओके, नाउ बोथ हैव देयर इश्यूज. अंडर न्यूट्रिशन से यू कैन हैव stunting, impaired mental development, etc. Overnutrition can lead to like heart diseases, obesity, kidney failure, etc. So let's look at the key and the important findings of this report. So it says that anemia in childhood is increased in 18 states and union territories. It has says that severe acute malnutrition has increased in 16 states. A percentage of children under 5 years who are underweight has increased in 16 states. Childhood stunting or like low growth of low increase in height has increased in 13 of the 22 states, and most states generally saw an increase in overweight and obesity prevalence among children and adults, right? So इंडिया में डुअल क्राइसिस चल रहा है. एक क्राइसिस है एब्सेंस का और दूसरा क्राइसिस है प्लेंटी का. So there are people in India. So the number of people in India who do not have adequate food to eat is also increasing, and the number of people in India who are eating more than they should be eating is also increasing. So the number of underweight and undernutrition people is also increasing, and the number of fat and the number of over nutrition people is also increasing. So there's a dual crisis that India is facing. So normal लोगों की संख्या कम हो रही है basically. Okay. Now let's understand what is the impact of malnutrition in children. Okay. So first is intergenerational effects. Malnutrition basically generally comes out of poverty and low social status. So it's not like a one generation thing, right? So let's say if a family suffers from undernutrition, मतलब वो गरीब हैं, they don't have enough money, etc. Now that will be an intergenerational cycle, and undernourished parents will give birth to children who will have a propensity to be undernourished, and that cycle will continue to move on. And because they are undernourished, their mental impairments, mental development, mental faculties, etc. would not be highly developed. This would be a sad loop, and this would then limit their social mobility. It will prevent people from moving socially upward, because education, खाना नहीं है तो education etc तो बिल्कुल नहीं होगा. So you won't have education, you won't have proper nutrition, your mental faculties etc will not be developed, and you won't be able to perform complex tasks, right? तो आप उसी स्ट्रेटा में, बल्कि कमजोर स्ट्रेटा में ही जाते रहोगे. Now obviously, if you don't have enough food to eat, there is a risk of diseases like diarrhea, measles, malaria etc. And then you have developmental delays etc. आपका दिमाग इतना तेज नहीं होता, you can't understand a lot of things, so that is a problem. And as a result of all of that, there will be lower productivity in later life. If you've grown up under nutrition, if you do not have, if your mind and brain is not developed, there is a limited number of tasks that you can do. आप labor ही बन के रह जाओगे. You won't be able to do a lot of complex tasks for which you need like a good mental development. Okay. Now, obviously, if you're an undernutrition female child in India, you will most likely grow up to be an undernutrition anemic adult. And when you have a child in India, there would be a greater risk of pregnancy related complications and death if you are an undernourished female in India. Okay. Now, the reasons for basically this rise in malnutrition are very similar. Recently, we've seen pre-COVID also the economic condition in India was deteriorating, right? So and obviously with the deterioration of the economic conditions for the last 3-4 years, lesser people didn't have enough money to buy and eat food with good nutrition. Ek to wo tha. Then the pandemic also happened, right? So lockdown, basically people are dying of hunger, people were undernutrition before the lockdown. Now just imagine what the lockdown would have done. Now then, this is one problem. The another problem is of underfunding. The Indian state does not have enough money, and even if we have enough money, that money is not being utilized. So for example, in December 2019, the Ministry of Women and Child Development clarified that out of the funds that were released for the Poshan Abhiyan, I'll tell what the Poshan Abhiyan is in the next slide, only about 32% or 1/3 of the fund has been used. तो एक तो वैसे ही पैसा नहीं है, और जो भी पैसा बाद में आता है उसमें भी आप वो पैसा यूज नहीं कर पा रहे हो. ठीक है. Now let's try to look at what are the steps that have been taken by Government of India. So these are some schemes that are important. You can probably be asked a question from any of these. So the first is the Poshan Abhiyan, or the National Nutrition Mission. So this is Government of India's flagship program, which basically aims to improve the nutrition of children, pregnant women, and lactating mothers. So these are the categories that are targeted. You should remember Poshan Abhiyan is for children, pregnant women, and lactating mothers. Okay. Now, then under the Poshan Abhiyan itself, because it is a flagship mission, right? There are multiple missions under it. You have the Anemia Mukt Bharat strategy, which was launched in 2018. So the idea is to give iron and folic acid supplementation to people in India, and to make sure that you can fight anemia through supplementation. And if let's say somebody has anemia related complications, you give them adequate care and treatment. Now, this targets 6 groups, which is pregnant women, lactating mothers and children, and 3 other sorts of groups. So you should know that more than half of the women in India are anemic, right? So anemia is a major problem in India. Okay. Now, then you have another older scheme known as the Integrated Child Development Scheme. This is the ICDS. So this aims to improve nutrition and health status of children between the age group of 0 to 6 years. Okay. Now, under this itself, you have the midday meal scheme. Basically, अगर आप सरकारी स्कूल में पढ़ते हो, so from class 1 to class 8, you get 1 meal a day in the school. So country की हालत इतनी खराब है that एक तो लोगों के पास खाना नहीं है. So you obviously give them food if they're coming to school. Now, parents now sort of have an incentive to send their children to school. चलो खाना तो मिल जाएगा, right? So people don't study. Generally parents don't want to send children to study. Sometimes they think ये मजदूरी कर लेगा तो 2 पैसे ही कमा लेगा. So there are multiple problems and multiple layers of problems that India is facing. So the midday meal scheme is a good idea in the sense that it gives money. I mean, it gives food to these children, and it sort of gives an incentive to the parents to send their children to school. अगर बच्चा आ ही गया खाना खाने तो कुछ तो सीख के जाएगा. ठीक है. Then you have the public distribution system, which basically covers up to 75% of the rural population and up to 50% of the urban population. Now, this is This is something that I'm not going to talk about right now, because a lot of discussion happened in the month of February and March, in the sense that the government said that we need to move away from this right to food that we've given to people. The financial burden of providing food to so many people is increasing for the government. So हम इसे यहाँ cover नहीं करेंगे. Most likely we will discuss it for your January, February or March ka current affairs. Okay. Now another strategy that has now been adopted by the government is a food fortification. So the idea is very simple. सिर्फ चावल और गेहूं खा के मैल न्यूट्रिशन की प्रॉब्लम सॉल्व नहीं हो पाएगी. देयर आर सर्टेन एसेंशियल मिनरल्स and vitamins like iron, folic acid, vitamin K, iodine, etc. Now these are added artificially to food items, and this idea of adding these important minerals and vitamins to food items is known as fortification, right? So there is a centrally sponsored pilot scheme which is being run in a few states right now. It will then become a national scheme. So under which basically instead of normal rice and wheat, what is being distributed is fortified rice and wheat, which has, apart from carbs, etc., it has a lot of these vital vitamins and minerals, जिसकी वजह से malnutrition का problem can be tackled a little. Okay. So your public distribution system is something that we will discuss in February or March ka current affairs. There are a lot of articles around the budget for your public distribution system scheme. We will discuss this later. So guys, this is pretty much that I had for today's lecture. Thank you for listening.